My name is Rebecca Stone. I'm 34 years old, and after building a successful financial planning practice that allows me to help clients secure their futures while generating substantial income for myself, I sat through another devastating family dinner where my father Charles called me useless and declared that my unemployed 31-year-old brother Tyler carries this whole family, while my mother Susan nodded in agreement, completely dismissing the fact that I had secretly liquidated my retirement savings and taken business loans to pay the $61,000 in medical bills that saved Charles's life when he had his heart attack 2 years ago. What they didn't know was that their praise for Tyler's imaginary contributions while calling me worthless was about to be shattered when I revealed exactly who had wired the money for his emergency surgery, transforming their false narrative about family heroes into a devastating confrontation with financial reality. The family dynamics that would explode during that dinner had been building for years through a pattern of favoritism that consistently elevated Tyler's minimal presence over my substantial contributions, creating a mythology where lounging around the house playing video games was somehow more valuable than earning the money that kept our family financially stable during crisis situations. Tyler is such a devoted son, Susan would say whenever relatives asked about her children during family gatherings. He lives at home to help take care of us, drives us to appointments when we need transportation, and provides so much emotional support during difficult times. He really sacrifices everything for this family. The characterization of Tyler's unemployment and continued dependence on parental support as sacrifice and devotion, while dismissing my career success and financial independence as evidence that I was too busy or too focused on money, perfectly captured how my family had rewritten reality to justify their obvious favoritism. Rebecca is doing well with her business, Susan would continue with the kind of obligatory acknowledgement that made it clear my achievements were secondary to Tyler's supposed contributions. She's always been good with money, but Tyler understands what family really means. The implication that financial success somehow disqualified me from understanding family values, while Tyler's lack of employment or independence demonstrated superior character, was both insulting and revealing about how my parents viewed achievement versus dependency in their adult children. My financial planning practice had grown steadily over 8 years from a small client base to managing over $15 million in assets for individuals and families who trusted me to help them build wealth, plan for retirement, and navigate major financial decisions that would affect their security for decades to come. Rebecca really understands how money works, my clients would say when referring friends and colleagues to my practice. She helped us increase our retirement savings by 40% while reducing our tax liability and insurance costs. We trust her judgment completely when it comes to major financial planning decisions. The professional recognition and client success that had built my reputation in the financial services industry was apparently less impressive to my family than Tyler's willingness to drive my parents to doctor appointments and provide what they considered emotional support during challenging periods. But while Tyler was being praised for his presence and emotional availability, I was the family member who actually solved problems through practical action and financial resources that addressed real needs rather than just providing comfort and companionship during difficult situations. The medical crisis that would reveal the true nature of our family contributions began 2 years ago when Charles suffered a massive heart attack that required emergency surgery, followed by months of rehabilitation and ongoing medical treatment that created financial obligations far beyond what their insurance coverage would address. Your father's medical bills are over $61,000 after insurance, Susan had told me during one of her panicked phone calls about their financial situation. We don't have that kind of money, and the hospital is demanding payment arrangements that we can't afford on his disability income. The medical debt represented more than Charles's annual income and threatened not just their immediate financial stability, but also their ability to maintain their home, their credit rating, and their basic standard of living during his recovery period when his earning capacity was severely limited. "What are you going to do?" I had asked, already knowing that I would need to find a way to help them avoid bankruptcy and financial ruin that would devastate their retirement security. and force them to lose their home during the most vulnerable period of their lives. Tyler is looking into payment plans and charity programs, Susan had replied, with hope that somehow their son's research and emotional support would solve a financial crisis that required actual money rather than just investigation and companionship. But while Tyler was looking into potential solutions and providing emotional comfort during their crisis, I was taking immediate action to prevent their financial destruction through personal sacrifice that I knew my family would never fully appreciate or acknowledge. Have you ever been the family member who solves serious problems through personal financial sacrifice while watching someone else receive credit for providing emotional support and investigating solutions they could never actually implement? That's exactly what I was experiencing as my family's medical crisis required resources that only I could provide. "I'll handle the medical bills," I had told Susan without explaining how devastating this decision would be for my own financial security and business development plans. "Dawn, don't worry about the hospital payments or the rehabilitation costs. Just focus on Dad's recovery." The decision to cover $61,000 in medical expenses required me to liquidate most of my retirement savings, take loans against my business assets, and delay expansion plans that would have grown my practice and increased my long-term earning potential significantly. "Rebecca, we can't ask you to pay for Dad's medical bills." Susan had protested with guilt about accepting such massive financial assistance from her daughter. "That's too much money. And it's not fair to expect you to sacrifice your own financial security for our medical problems." "Mom, Dad needs the surgery and rehabilitation," I had replied with practical focus on solutions rather than fairness or burden distribution. "If he doesn't get proper medical care, he could die or be permanently disabled. We can worry about fairness later." The wire transfer of $61,000 to cover Charles's medical expenses was processed on a Tuesday morning, while I sat in my office calculating how long it would take to rebuild my retirement savings and repay the business loans I had taken to keep my parents from facing bankruptcy during their medical emergency. "Payment received in full," the hospital financial counselor had called to confirm. "Your father's account is current, and all future treatments and rehabilitation services are covered through his recovery period." The relief I felt knowing that Charles would receive the medical care he needed without financial stress was both personally satisfying and professionally ruinous, since the sacrifice had eliminated years of careful financial planning and business development investments. But while I was quietly managing the financial crisis that could have destroyed my parents' retirement security and forced them to lose their home, Tyler was being praised for providing transportation to medical appointments and emotional support that my parents apparently valued more than the actual money that made their treatment and recovery possible. "Tyler has been such a rock during this whole medical situation," Charles would tell visitors and relatives who inquired about his recovery progress. "He drives us everywhere, helps around the house, and never complains about the extra responsibilities he's taken on to help us through this difficult time." The praise for Tyler's transportation services and household assistance, while completely ignoring the financial support that had prevented bankruptcy and homelessness, was both hurtful and revealing about how my parents measured family contribution and loyalty. The woman who had sacrificed her retirement security to save her father's life was about to discover that her family valued presence more than payment, emotional support more than financial rescue, and Tyler's minimal contributions more than her life-changing generosity that had literally made his survival possible. The explosive family dinner that would finally force a confrontation about who actually carried the family began on a Sunday evening when I arrived at my parents' house expecting the usual weekly gathering, but instead walked into an atmosphere of tension and frustration that had been building during Charles's continued recovery from his heart attack and ongoing health complications. "Rebecca, I'm glad you're here," Susan said as she greeted me at the door. But her expression suggested this wasn't a social invitation, but rather preparation for a difficult conversation about family dynamics and responsibilities that had been creating stress for weeks. Tyler was already seated at the dining room table, scrolling through his phone with the kind of casual comfort that came from living rent-free in his childhood bedroom, while receiving constant praise for his minimal contributions to household management and family support during our parents' ongoing medical and financial recovery. "How's business?" Charles asked with the obligatory interest he showed in my career, though his tone suggested he viewed my financial success as less important than whatever family drama was about to unfold during dinner. "Business is good," I replied, not mentioning that my practice was still recovering from the financial impact of liquidating assets and taking loans to pay for his medical bills that had saved his life, while creating years of additional work for me to rebuild my retirement security. The dinner conversation that followed was strained and uncomfortable, with Charles expressing frustration about his recovery limitations, Susan worrying about ongoing medical expenses, and Tyler offering commentary about various family situations without acknowledging his continued unemployment or dependence on parental support for his basic living expenses. "I've been thinking about our family situation lately," Charles said as we finished eating, his voice taking on the serious tone he used when he wanted to address what he considered important family matters. "About who really contributes to this family and who just takes advantage of the support they receive." The setup for what was clearly going to be a lecture about family responsibility and contribution was both ominous and ironic, since Charles was apparently planning to discuss family support while completely ignoring the financial support that had prevented his bankruptcy and possibly his death. "Tyler has really stepped up during my recovery," Charles continued with obvious pride in his son's supposed dedication. "He's here every day, helps with everything around the house, drives us to appointments when we need transportation, and never complains about the sacrifices he's making to help us through this difficult period." The praise for Tyler's presence and transportation services while living rent-free and unemployed was typical of how my parents had elevated his basic helpfulness into heroic family contribution that somehow exceeded my actual financial sacrifice and professional success. "Rebecca, I need you to understand something," Charles said, turning his attention to me with obvious disappointment. "Tyler carries this family. He's the one who made real sacrifices to help us when we needed it most. He's the one who put his own life on hold to take care of us." The characterization of Tyler's continued unemployment and parental dependence as putting his life on hold, while dismissing my actual career success and financial contribution, was both factually inaccurate and emotionally devastating. "Meanwhile," Charles continued with growing anger, "you're always too busy with work to help with anything important. You're so focused on making money that you can't be bothered to spend time with family members who need your support and attention. Have you ever been criticized for working to earn the money that solved your family's problems, while someone who contributed nothing received praise for their presence?" That's exactly what I was experiencing as Charles attacked my work ethic while praising Tyler's unemployment. "Dad, I help the family in different ways," I said, trying to defend my contributions without revealing the extent of the financial support I had provided during his medical crisis. "I've always been available when you needed assistance." "What ways?" Charles demanded with obvious skepticism about my claims of family support. "When was the last time you drove us to a medical appointment? When was the last time you spent a whole day helping around the house instead of rushing off to work on some money-making scheme?" The focus on physical presence and transportation services, while completely ignoring financial support that had literally saved his life, was both cruel and revealing about how Charles measured family loyalty and contribution. "Tyler lives here and helps us every day," Charles continued with increasing aggression. "He gave up his own apartment to move back home and take care of us. He drives us everywhere because you're always too busy with your precious clients to help your own parents." The fact that Tyler had never actually moved out of his childhood bedroom and had never maintained independent housing was apparently irrelevant to Charles's narrative about sacrificial son versus selfish daughter who prioritized career over family needs. "You're useless when it comes to real family support," Charles finally exploded with anger that had been building throughout the conversation. "Tyler sacrifices everything for this family, and you can't even be bothered to show up when we need you." All you care about is making money and building your business while your brother carries the real burden of taking care of us. The devastating attack on my character and contribution while praising Tyler's imaginary sacrifices was the moment I realized that my family had completely rewritten the history of their medical crisis to erase my financial contribution while elevating Tyler's minimal presence into heroic family leadership. But what Charles didn't understand was that his useless daughter was about to reveal exactly who had wired the $61,000 that saved his life, and his narrative about Tyler carrying the family was about to collapse when confronted with banking records that would show who actually carried the financial burden of their medical emergency. The moment of truth that would shatter my family's false narrative about contributions and sacrifice came when Charles's attack on my character finally pushed me beyond my tolerance for being called useless, while my secret financial support made their comfortable recovery possible. "Tyler, I have a question for you," I said, standing up from the dinner table with calm determination that immediately changed the atmosphere in the room from Charles's angry lecture to something more serious and confrontational. "What question?" Tyler asked with obvious nervousness about the shift in conversation dynamics and my formal tone that suggested this wasn't casual family discussion, but rather direct challenge to something important. "Who wired the $61,000 for Dad's heart surgery and rehabilitation?" I asked with precise clarity about the financial reality that had been hidden from family narrative for 2 years. The silence that followed my question was immediate and complete, as Tyler's face went pale and Charles looked confused about what I was referring to, while Susan suddenly became very interested in cleaning dishes and avoiding eye contact with anyone at the table. "What are you talking about?" Charles demanded with confusion about financial details he had apparently never investigated or understood during his medical crisis. "What $61,000 wire transfer?" "The $61,000 that paid for your emergency surgery, your rehabilitation, your medication, and all the medical expenses that insurance didn't cover," I replied while reaching for my purse where I kept copies of financial documents that would prove who actually saved his life. "Tyler handles our financial arrangements," Charles said with continued confidence in his son's supposed family management capabilities. "He worked with the hospital to set up payment plans and handle all the medical billing issues." The belief that Tyler had handled financial arrangements worth $61,000 through payment plans rather than actual money was about to be challenged by banking records that would reveal the truth about who provided the resources that prevented bankruptcy and made Charles's recovery possible. "Tyler, tell Dad how you paid the medical bills," I said with direct challenge that would force him to either admit his lack of financial contribution or lie about arrangements he had never made and could never have afforded on his non-existent income. I worked with the hospital," Tyler stammered with obvious anxiety about being forced to explain specific financial arrangements he had never actually managed. "I set up payments and talked to their financial counselor about options." "What payments?" I pressed with continued focus on specific financial details that would expose the difference between Tyler's research and investigation versus actual monetary contribution to family medical crisis. "Monthly payments," Tyler replied with vague explanation that revealed his ignorance about the actual financial arrangements that had resolved their medical debt. "We worked out a plan that the hospital accepted." Have you ever watched someone try to take credit for financial arrangements they never made while facing questions that would expose their complete ignorance about the actual money that solved family problems? That's exactly what was happening as Tyler's false narrative began to collapse under specific questioning. "Dad, would you like to see the banking records that show who actually paid your medical bills?" I asked, while pulling out copies of wire transfer receipts, loan documentation, and retirement account liquidation records that would prove whose money had saved his life. "What banking records?" Charles asked with growing confusion and concern about financial details he was apparently learning about for the first time, despite 2 years of recovery that had been made possible by payment arrangements he had never understood. "These banking records," I said, spreading documents across the dinner table that showed $61,000 in payments from my accounts to various medical providers, rehabilitation centers, and hospitals that had treated Charles during his cardiac emergency and recovery period. The documentation was comprehensive and undeniable, showing dates, amounts, and recipient information that proved beyond any doubt that I had personally funded Charles's medical treatment, while Tyler had contributed nothing except transportation and emotional support. This shows a $35,000 wire transfer from Rebecca Stone to City General Hospital for cardiac surgery, I read from one document. This shows a $15,000 payment to Rehabilitation Associates for physical therapy services. This shows $11,000 in payments to various specialists and medication providers. Each line item represented a specific aspect of Charles's medical treatment that had been funded through my personal financial sacrifice, rather than Tyler's supposed payment arrangements or family management capabilities. "Rebecca," Charles whispered with growing understanding about the magnitude of what I had done to save his life. "You paid for my medical treatment?" "I paid for everything," I confirmed with matter-of-fact clarity about financial reality that had been hidden from family discussion for 2 years. "I liquidated my retirement savings, took loans against my business, and delayed my expansion plans to cover medical expenses that would have forced you into bankruptcy." The comprehensive explanation of personal financial sacrifice while Tyler received praise for providing transportation and emotional support was both vindication of my actual contribution and devastating exposure of the false narrative that had elevated him to hero status. "Tyler never paid anything," I continued with accuracy about his complete lack of financial contribution to the family medical crisis. "He researched payment options and drove you to appointments, but every dollar that paid for your survival came from my accounts, my retirement savings, and my business assets." The revelation that Tyler's supposed financial management had been entirely fictional, while my financial sacrifice had been entirely real, was transforming the family dinner from Charles's lecture about useless daughters into devastating confrontation with truth about who actually carried the family during their most serious crisis. "Susan," I said, looking directly at my mother who had been avoiding eye contact throughout the revelation, "you knew this. You knew I paid the medical bills, and you've been sitting here listening to Dad call me useless while praising Tyler for contributions he never made." The direct challenge to Susan's complicity in maintaining false narrative about family contributions was the moment when our family's mythology about heroes and sacrifice would finally collapse under the weight of financial documentation and forced accountability. The complete emotional collapse of my family's false narrative began with Charles, whose realization that his useless daughter had literally saved his life while he praised his heroic son for doing essentially nothing created a psychological crisis that was both devastating and entirely appropriate given the magnitude of their distorted family mythology. "I called you useless," Charles whispered with horror, as he stared at the banking records that proved I had sacrificed my retirement security to pay for medical treatment that had prevented his death. "I told you that Tyler carries this family, and you're the one who saved my life." The recognition that his harsh criticism of my character and contribution had been directed at the person who had made his survival possible was both emotionally devastating for Charles and personally vindicating for me after years of being dismissed as the family member who cared more about money than family relationships. "Rebecca, I didn't know," Charles continued with tears in his eyes, as he began to understand the scope of financial sacrifice I had made while remaining silent about my contribution to preserve family harmony and Tyler's self-esteem. "Why didn't you tell us you were paying for everything?" "Because I didn't want Tyler to feel bad about not being able to contribute financially," I replied with honesty about my motivation for keeping my financial support secret. "I thought you would eventually understand that different family members help in different ways." The explanation that I had hidden my financial sacrifice to protect Tyler's feelings while he received praise for minimal contributions was both generous and naive, since it had enabled a false narrative that ultimately led to Charles calling me useless while living off my money. "Tyler," Charles turned to his son with devastating recognition of how completely he had misunderstood family contributions and heroism. "You never paid for any of my medical treatment?" "I helped in other ways," Tyler replied with defensive justification for his lack of financial contribution. "I provided emotional support and transportation. I was here every day helping around the house and taking care of you." "See, but you didn't pay $61,000 to save my life," Charles said with accurate summary of the financial reality that had been obscured by praise for Tyler's presence and assistance. "Rebecca sacrificed her retirement savings and took business loans to prevent me from dying or going bankrupt." The stark comparison between Tyler's presence and my financial sacrifice was forcing Charles to confront how completely he had misunderstood which family member had actually carried the family during their medical crisis. "Susan," Charles said, turning to his wife with growing anger about her role in maintaining the false narrative. "You knew Rebecca paid for my medical treatment, and you let me call her useless while praising Tyler for contributions he never made?" "I felt guilty about Rebecca spending so much money," Susan admitted with tears streaming down her face. "I wanted to believe that Tyler was contributing in equally important ways, so I encouraged the idea that his emotional support and presence were just as valuable as Rebecca's financial sacrifice." The confession that Susan had deliberately maintained false equivalence between Tyler's minimal contributions and my massive financial sacrifice revealed the psychological manipulation that had been necessary to preserve their preferred family mythology about which child was more devoted and supportive. Have you ever watched your family realize that they had been living a lie about your value while taking your most generous contributions completely for granted? That's exactly what I was experiencing as the truth finally destroyed years of false narrative and misplaced praise. "Rebecca literally saved my life," Charles said with growing recognition of how profoundly he had misjudged family contributions and loyalty. "She risked her own financial security to pay for medical treatment that I couldn't afford, and I've been calling her useless while praising Tyler for driving me to appointments." The devastating summary of family dynamics was both accurate and painful, forcing Charles to confront how his favoritism and misunderstanding had hurt the daughter who had actually sacrificed the most to ensure his survival and recovery. "Tyler, your entire identity as the family hero has been built on lies," I said with direct confrontation about his false status and the reality that his contributions had been minimal compared to what family mythology had attributed to him. "I helped in real ways," Tyler protested with continued denial about the magnitude of difference between his assistance and my financial sacrifice. Emotional support and daily help are important contributions to family recovery and stability. "Tyler, emotional support doesn't pay $61,000 in medical bills," Charles replied with harsh reality about the practical difference between comfort and actual problem-solving during life-threatening medical emergencies. The recognition that Tyler's contributions, while genuine, were completely inadequate compared to what he had been receiving credit for was beginning to destroy his self-concept as the family member who had carried everyone through their most difficult period. "I don't know what to say," Tyler said with genuine confusion about his role in family dynamics and his responsibility for accepting praise he had never earned. "I thought I was helping as much as anyone else." "You were helping, but you weren't carrying the family," I replied with accuracy about the reality that different types of assistance have different levels of impact and significance. "I was carrying the family financially while you were helping with daily tasks and emotional support." The distinction between different types of family contribution was important because it addressed the false equivalence that had been used to elevate Tyler's presence into heroic sacrifice while minimizing my financial sacrifice as mere money-making that didn't demonstrate genuine family devotion. But while my family processed the devastating truth about their false mythology and misplaced praise, I was preparing to deliver an ultimatum that would force them to choose between continuing their comfortable illusions and maintaining the financial support that had made their stability possible. The ultimatum that would transform our family dynamics from false mythology to honest acknowledgement came as I realized that years of being called useless while secretly subsidizing my family's survival had reached the point where I needed to establish clear consequences for continued disrespect and misattribution of my contributions. "I have something important to tell you," I announced with the calm determination that comes from finally deciding to protect yourself from people who take your greatest sacrifices for granted while praising others for minimal contributions. "I'm done being the invisible supporter who gets criticized while other people receive credit for my generosity." The formal tone and serious implication of my statement immediately captured everyone's attention, as they began to understand that the revelation about medical bill payments was not just historical correction, but preparation for significant changes in family financial arrangements and relationships. "What do you mean?" Susan asked with growing anxiety about the implications of my statement for family stability and the financial support they had been receiving without acknowledging or appreciating its source. "I mean that I'm not going to continue paying for family expenses while being called useless and listening to Tyler receive praise for contributions he never made," I replied with clarity about the connection between respect and financial support that my family had never been forced to consider. The direct statement about ending financial support while demanding appropriate recognition was both overdue and necessary, since my family's comfortable mythology about contributions and sacrifice had been built on taking my generosity for granted while attributing family survival to Tyler's presence. "Rebecca, you can't just stop helping the family because your feelings were hurt," Tyler said with obvious panic about losing financial support he had never provided but had been receiving credit for managing and coordinating. "Tyler, this isn't about hurt feelings," I replied with accuracy about the distinction between emotional reactions and business decisions. "This is about family members who call me useless while living off money I earned and sacrificed to keep them financially stable." The clarification that my decision was based on practical assessment of family dynamics rather than emotional overreaction was important because it established that I was making calculated choices about financial support based on how my contributions were acknowledged and valued. "What are you asking from us?" Charles said with resignation about the reality that his harsh criticism of my character had been directed at the person whose financial support was essential for family stability and comfort. "I'm asking for public acknowledgement that I paid the medical bills that saved your life," I said with specific requirements for ending the false narrative that had given Tyler unearned credit for family financial management. "I'm asking for recognition that my financial sacrifice was more significant than Tyler's transportation and emotional support." The demand for accurate attribution of family contributions was both reasonable and overdue, since years of false mythology had created family dynamics where my most generous sacrifices were invisible, while Tyler's minimal assistance was treated as heroic devotion. "I'm also asking for an end to Tyler's status as the family hero who carries everyone." I continued with additional requirements for maintaining financial support that had been taken for granted for too long. "He helps with daily tasks, but he doesn't earn the money that pays for family stability and emergency expenses." The requirement that Tyler's actual contributions be accurately characterized rather than inflated into family leadership was necessary to prevent continuation of dynamics where minimal assistance received maximum praise while substantial sacrifice was ignored or criticized. "And if we don't agree to these conditions?" Charles asked, with understanding that his financial security depended on maintaining relationships with the daughter he had called useless, while praising the son who had contributed nothing to their survival. "Then I'll consider the $61,000 I spent on your medical bills to be a loan that requires repayment," I said with ultimate consequence for continued disrespect and false attribution of family contributions. "I'll also stop providing any future financial assistance for family emergencies or ongoing support needs." Have you ever forced family members to choose between their pride and their financial survival after years of taking your generosity for granted? That's exactly what I was doing as I established clear consequences for continued ingratitude and misattribution of my contributions. "Rebecca, we can't repay $61,000, Susan said with panic about the possibility that their daughter's financial sacrifice might become a debt obligation they could never satisfy on Charles's limited disability income and Tyler's non-existent earnings. Then you need to start acknowledging who actually saved this family and stop calling me useless while praising Tyler for contributions he never made, I replied with simple solution that would preserve family financial arrangements while establishing appropriate recognition for actual contributions. We'll acknowledge your financial contributions, Charles said with resignation, about accepting truth that would require admitting how completely he had misjudged family loyalty and sacrifice. You saved my life, and Tyler provided daily assistance. Both contributions were important, but yours was more costly and more essential. The acknowledgement that my financial sacrifice was more essential than Tyler's presence was both accurate and painful for a family that had built their entire mythology around the idea that emotional support and physical presence were equivalent to financial rescue during life-threatening emergencies. Tyler will also need to stop claiming credit for financial arrangements he never made, I added with specific requirement for ending his false hero status. He can be proud of helping with transportation and daily tasks, but he can't continue pretending that he managed family finances during the medical crisis. I understand, Tyler said with defeated acceptance about losing identity as family financial manager that had been based entirely on lies and false attribution of my contributions. I helped in other ways, but I didn't pay for Dad's medical treatment. The admission that his supposed financial management had been fictional was both honest and necessary for establishing accurate family narrative about who actually solved problems versus who provided comfort during crisis situations. 6 months after the dinner confrontation that had exposed the truth about family contributions and sacrifice, our relationships had evolved into something more honest and balanced, with appropriate recognition for different types of assistance and clear understanding about who provided what kinds of family support. Thank you for saving my life, Charles said during one of our monthly family dinners. And I'm sorry it took me so long to understand what you sacrificed to pay for my medical treatment. I was wrong to call you useless when you were actually the most essential family member during our crisis. The regular acknowledgement of my financial contribution and its life-saving significance was both personally meaningful and practically necessary for maintaining family relationships based on truth rather than mythology about contributions and heroism. Tyler helps us with daily tasks and provides emotional support, Susan added with accurate characterization of his actual contributions. But Rebecca provides financial security and emergency assistance that makes our stability possible. We need both types of help, but we understand which one is more essential during serious crises. The honest assessment of different family contributions without false equivalence between daily assistance and life-saving financial sacrifice was exactly what I had been seeking through years of invisible support and recent confrontation. If you're reading this and you're providing financial support for family members who call you selfish while praising others for minimal contributions, please know that you have the right to demand appropriate recognition for your sacrifices and accurate attribution of your contributions to family stability. Sometimes the people who benefit most from your generosity are the ones who value it least, and sometimes you must force acknowledgement of your worth by threatening to remove the support they've been taking for granted while crediting others for your sacrifices. If this story resonated with your own experiences, please hit that subscribe button and share your experiences in the comments below. Have you ever been the invisible family supporter who was criticized while others received praise for your contributions? How did you handle family members who took credit for your sacrifices? Your story might help someone else who's struggling with similar family dynamics and unacknowledged generosity. Thank you for joining me on this journey from invisible sacrifice, through family confrontation, to honest recognition and balanced relationships. Remember that your contributions have value, and family members who call you useless while living off your support need to learn that your generosity comes with the expectation of appropriate respect and accurate acknowledgement. See you in our next story here at Her Sweet Revenge.